All right, welcome back. This is Pastor Craig at Central Assembly, a Navy Reserve chaplain. I am excited to have you back again. We're going to jump right back in where we left off last time. That's in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18 through 22. We're taking a smaller chunk because this is a kind of an interesting passage and really helps us to dive deep into this first century Jewish literature and first century Jewish way of thinking. So this one, I felt like I needed to drop anchor on a little bit, so we've taken a shorter chunk here. But let's go ahead and read chapter 3, verse 18 through 22. That starts out with, "Because Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust." And you can see a tie back here to our previous lesson. "To bring you to God by being put to death in the flesh, but by being made alive in the Spirit. In it, he went and preached to the spirits in prison, after they were disobedient long ago, when God patiently waited in the days of Noah, as an ark was being constructed. In the ark, a few, that is 8 souls, were delivered through water. And it is this prefigured baptism, which now saves you. Not the washing of the physical dirt, but the pledge of a good conscience to God, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who went into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels and authorities and powers subject to him." Okay, you can see there is a lot going on in this passage. Maybe even too much, but we got to take it all together. So there's a lot going on here. Let's think a little bit, if we can. Let's try to put ourselves in the first century where 1 Peter is at. He's trying to communicate a message to the Christians in Asia Minor who have been removed from Rome and placed in Asia Minor to colonize the area. We know this from Claudius, the emperor who did these deportations. We talked about that in our first session. But these Christians who were removed from Rome understood and were well read, I think, in the Jewish traditions. There was enough of this Jewish tradition in this group of people to have understood exactly what 1 Peter was saying here. What the letter of 1 Peter, but what Peter was saying here. So he's referencing something that they all held in common. And this is a normal way for Jews to teach. They would very often reference something in the Old Testament. When they reference just a little bit of it, they actually meant for you to bring into mind the whole expansive passage. So you're supposed to kind of take all of that passage together, and even though it was distilled down into just a few words or a sentence or just a paragraph, and what these Jewish teachers were referencing, like Peter, who's referencing this section, you're supposed to take in mind the whole body of knowledge that you have available to you in this section. So that's what Peter's doing here. You're supposed to keep in mind the Old Testament. You're supposed to look back at Genesis chapter 6. You're supposed to reread that whole story. You're supposed to bring it to memory and call it to mind. And we'll find here that he's actually referencing more than just Genesis chapter 6. He's referencing some of the Second Temple Judaism's writings. We're going to unpack that in just a minute. But first, let's start with some options for this souls, these spirits that he's preaching to in the these spirits that he's preaching to in prison. And again, I do want to call, before we get to prison, before we get to that passage there, I want to call to mind just really quickly this passage right here, the just for the unjust, to bring you to God by being put to death in the flesh, by being made alive in the Spirit. In the verse before, you can go back and look at the passage before, you've got Christ set aside in your heart. Okay, so we have something spiritual going on in our heart and mind. And Christ was in the Spirit. And when he was in the Spirit, he suffered once for sins. So we've got the just for the unjust. We've got, again, blessings and cursings and insults for insults, but we're not going to do insults for insults. We're going to do blessings for cursings. We're going to treat people with kindness when they insult us. And here we have the example of Christ doing that for us. And when he brings us to God, he's being put to death in the flesh, being made alive in the Spirit. What we are talking about here, again, keep in mind, is ultimate vindication. How on earth are you going to survive as a Christian when you're not treated properly, when you're not treated right, when you're being persecuted? How are you going to make it through this life? And not just these people who are being made in Asia Minor, who are being made to suffer for their belief in Christ. But I think Peter is referencing a whole slew of things that are applicable in our lives today, in our modern contexts. Sometimes you do everything right. Sometimes you treat your coworkers properly. Sometimes you give them respect. Sometimes you give them deference. You treat your employers properly. You're there on time. You do all the right things. And people still insist on trading you your kindness and good faith and good attitudes for unkindness and unjust and insults. So Peter is looking at this whole range of Christian activity that I think is really applicable for us in our life today. Okay, let's push forward. That's what's in view. Okay, that's the key part of this whole thing. We got to remember what Peter's talking to, and it helps us actually to unpack the rest of what's going on. So let's take a look at the next verse here. And into this next verse, we're going to see that he went and preached to the spirits in prison. We're actually going to look at this word right here, spirits in prison. That's what we're looking at right there. This Greek word, spirits, is an interesting word. And in the language of Greek, in the wider body of literature available, so outside of the New Testament into Second Temple Jewish literature, and even into classical Greek literature, this particular word, spirits, only ever refers to malevolent, evil spirits. It never refers to human souls or human spirits. The Greeks, not that Peter was using Greek language, or he was using the Greek language, but he wasn't necessarily speaking to Greeks. The Greeks had an understanding of the difference between an evil spirit and a human soul, so to speak, and they were different concepts and different words. So there was a different word for this, and Peter chose this word in specifically to communicate to his audience who he was talking about. So when he says spirits in prison, he's talking about evil spirits in prison. That's what he's talking about. Okay. So these are evil spirits. Okay? Now, in prison, what is he talking about when he says in prison? That seems confusing and interesting. All right, we have come now to Second Temple Jewish literature. And the book that he's specifically referring to is a very popular writing. It was like top shelf, Tom Grisham, or Grisham's, best-selling, New York Times best-selling list. You can tell I don't read a whole lot of those books. But the point, Tom Clancy, I don't know, take your pick. This was big-time Jewish literature. Even if you never watched the Da Vinci Code, you kind of know what's going on. Even if you've never watched Star Wars, you kind of know what's going on. That's the Book of Enoch in the Second Temple Jewish literature kind of world. Hugely popular. Everybody knew it. It had kind of invaded pop culture world. It was pretty ubiquitous. And so Peter references it. That's where this word prison comes from. It actually comes from the Book of Enoch. It's an interesting story. It's an odd story, and I welcome you to read it. Maybe what you shouldn't do is just YouTube Book of Enoch. What does it mean? That'll probably lead you down a weird spiral that is not worth your time. Now, if you want to get into aliens, you're welcome to do that, but maybe not. Okay, so what is Peter trying to say here? Well, first, let me tell you the bare bones skeleton version of this. There were angels called watchers in the book of 1 Enoch who left heaven, came down, descended on Mount Hermon in the land of Canaan, specifically, and made a pact with themselves that they were going to be in covenant with one another. They were going to rebel against God. And they were going to take human wives. They were going to procreate with human wives. And in the book of Enoch, they do this, and they bring with them a lot of secret knowledge. They bring knowledge of warfare and knowledge of seduction and knowledge of occult and knowledge of special remedies and naturopathy, maybe. I'm not saying naturopathy is wrong. I'm just saying that they bring with them all of this kind of supernatural, special, secret knowledge. And the end of the story is that God, of course, vanquishes these fallen angels, these rebellious spirits, and imprisons them in gloomy darkness forever. You can see this again in 2 Peter and in the book of Jude. They all reference this. Okay, so that's what he's talking about. That's the story. So when he says in it, in the Spirit, he went and preached to the spirits in prison. He's saying that Jesus is going down to these rebellious angels, these rebellious spirits, and he's going to preach to them. And he's going to say something to them. And what is he going to say? Well, I think, and we're going to look at this a little bit further in a second here, and he's going to talk a little bit more about where Christians are at. But before we get there, I want you to see, he is talking about ultimate vindication. Remember, he's talked about the hope that you have. We learned about that last time. He's talking about setting Christ in your heart and looking towards the future. And what if you're suffering for Christ right now today, what hope do you have? Why don't you just give up on Christ? Well, let's look to the future. Peter is saying that Jesus went and took a victory lap against those spirits and preached to those spirits and told them, you thought you could bring humanity into secret knowledge of warfare and seduction and occult. You thought you could bring them into secret knowledge. But I've come and I've established a kingdom of my heart, a kingdom of the heart. This is definitely and clearly given to, again, this Second Temple Jewish kind of understanding. They knew that the story of Noah in Genesis chapter 6, as we know it, was linked to this episode in Enoch. So Peter is clearly saying that Jesus is the one who is going to be winning in the end. And he wins over the spiritual darkness. So if Jesus is going to win over spiritual darkness and this angelic rebellion, then he can also win in your life. And there's hope for your life. That in the end, at the end of all things, he's got your back. And I think that's very, very, very encouraging. That's very exciting. To know that Christ has our back in this life, yes, but if you suffer in this life, don't let that shake you. Don't let that distract you. Don't be terrified. Know that in the end, Jesus has proclaimed victory over death and the evil spirits. The point of the passage is that Jesus is victorious in the spiritual realm. How much more will he be victorious in your life? That's exciting. I think that's good. All right. So let's look at some other things here, some important things that we need to look at. We're going to look at patiently waiting. Okay? Patiently waiting. This patiently waiting also is a reference to this, okay? And this was words that they would have known and understood. And in the Jewish tradition, we don't see this word patiently waited in Genesis under the flood narrative, but we do see this word patiently waited all throughout this Second Temple Jewish literature. It says that God patiently waited for mankind to return to Him during this period before the flood. And in fact, there were 10 generations from Adam to Noah, according to Genesis. And God provided ample time for Noah to build the ark. A long time. Scripture says that he was building the ark for a long time. And during that time that he was building the ark, he was preaching. But to no avail. His preaching didn't result in any fruit. So we do know that God patiently waited between Adam and Noah, and especially between this revolt, between these angelic watchers, as they're called, these spiritual beings. In between this revolt, where they completely led astray into things like warfare and seduction and occult mankind, God waited for a long time. A lot of people these days seem to think that the God of the Old Testament was wrathful and that He was cruel and capricious and was willing to flip back and forth and wipe out a whole humanity of people during the flood because He was cruel and unjust. But the reality is that He waited patiently for a very long time, hoping for people to return to Him. And Noah preached all the time, for a long time, as he was building the ark. Let's not forget that God waited a long time before sending the flood. Sometimes I think people are looking for an excuse to leave God, and they pick God's wrathfulness in the Old Testament as their excuse for getting out of Christianity and follow their own ways rather than looking for an answer to a legitimate question. The question of was God wrathful in the Old Testament is a legitimate question. But the answer isn't exiting. The answer is knowing the truth that God waited patiently and was gracious and kind. Okay? That's exciting. Let's push forward. Okay. In this, he prefigured baptism. Let's talk about prefiguring baptism. It's kind of a weird phrase. We haven't talked about that a whole lot before. This prefiguring baptism is a clear reference to the flood. Obviously, the whole world is covered in water, and when you're baptized, you're immersed in water. There's a water connection here, and it covering everything up. So what's the configuration? How is this a prefiguration of baptism? Well, in this time, when we think about what baptism means, a lot of times we imagine the flood as the thing that God is saving us from, or saving Noah from. We imagine this worldwide covering of water as a way of saving the flood. But the Second Temple Jewish literature actually looks at the flood as the instrument of salvation. In other words, the world had gotten so evil and so violent, which is what we find in Genesis. It had been so evil and so violent, and nobody was listening to the preaching and returning and repenting and coming back to God. It was so evil continually all the time that the flood actually rescued Noah from evil. The flood waters were actually the thing that purified, that were actually restored a sense of goodness and balance in the world, and allowed mankind to return to God through Noah and his seed. Noah journeyed through the water and was delivered to safety, not from the dangerous flood waters only. Yes, God did save him physically, but Noah built the ark, so he kind of had a hand in that. But God was the one that saved him from an evil world. And in the same way, you also, having traveled through the waters of baptism, are actually saved from the evil of the world and into the safety of the family of God. Again, these Christians in Asia Minor were under severe difficulties in their life. And these floodwaters, the baptism, their baptism, actually brings a purity and a cleanliness and a cleanness of heart. And they're able to now live in the way that Noah lived, with a new lease on life. You've been given new life. You've been rescued from the evil of the world. And even if you encounter difficulty and hardship, don't be shaken, don't be terrified. Know that you have a hope in Jesus Christ. Now, because Christ defeated the schemes of these evil spirits through the water of the flood, and since you have been baptized with Christ, and a way has been made for you to live a holy life, baptism is actually seen as a pledge of living with a good conscience. And we see that here, pledge of living with a good conscience. What do you mean by a pledge of good conscience? Well, your conscience can be clean. One of the biggest problems, I think, in this world is that a lot of people, I've met a lot of people, I was in construction for 10 years, I've been in the Navy for 20 years, I've been around a lot of people, a lot of human beings. And man, living with a clean conscience is a real problem. And people even who are not Christians wish they had a clean conscience. And so they're always looking for a way to clean their conscience. If I do enough good works, it outweighs the bad that I've done in my life. If I could only leave a good inheritance to my children, it would make up for all the bad things that I've done to them. Whatever, you take your pick. People try to save themselves a million different ways. But the point of baptism is that you have the pledge, the promise of a good conscience. God is promising you, kind of like the promise of a rainbow, right? God is making a promise in your life that you are clean and holy, even in the midst of difficulty, even in the midst of an evil world. You can have a clean conscience. And so, when you're being persecuted or life is difficult, you've got tough stuff going on in your life, don't return evil for evil. If you suffer for doing good, then there's a hope that Jesus Christ will vindicate you in the end. And by the way, I know it's tough, I know life is difficult, but you have the promise of a good conscience through the baptism that you have been in, the water baptism, the symbol of coming into God's family through this trial and through this tribulation. In the same way that God rescued Noah from an unrighteous world and evil forces, He's already rescued you, and it's clearly seen in your baptism. I hope this has been helpful. This is a tough passage to unpack. This is a difficult one for us to get through because there's so many different complexities and some weird things here. But I hope that this has been useful to you to unpack that. May the Lord bless you and keep you. I'll see you again next time.